Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming to this joint conference run by the Royal Society for Asian Affairs, the Wilson Center, and King's College London. The subject of China's Belt and Road Initiative is an intensely topical one in policy circles, perhaps a little less in academic ones, and has by and large been seen as an economic initiative, but it is inescapably one that has massive potential geostrategic and security implications as well. And the objective of this event today is to try and bring those two aspects of this major Chinese initiative together and to look at them alongside each other. And for that purpose, we have a very fine collection of speakers, both this morning and this afternoon. I should start, as nowadays is inevitable, unfortunately, by telling you that if the building starts to burn down, you should please escape in that direction. If you are looking for the toilets, they are to the left out of the doors and down towards the end of the corridor where the lifts are. Could I also ask you, please, either to turn off or to switch to silent your mobile phones? I'd like to take the opportunity as well to say how grateful we are as the Royal Society for Asian Affairs and the Wilson Center to King's College London and to the Lau China Institute in particular for the support they've given us for this event and the provision of King's College facilities to host it. We're very grateful to them for that. And to our publishers, Taylor and Francis, who have also given us financial support and through whose means, in due course, you will see the proceedings of this conference as an issue of the journal Asian Affairs in the spring. I am going to try and avoid falling off the stage. I am going to hand over now to Kerry Brown, who is chairing the morning session, and I will leave him to do the introductions. We break for lunch at 12:30 or earlier if people have lost interest by then, and we'll resume at 2. I'm afraid we have no coffee facilities in the room, but on the next floor up there is a coffee shop, should people want it. Thank you very much indeed. Kerry.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. So I'm the director of the Lau China Institute here at King's, and I'm very happy to be chairing the morning session. I'm also very grateful to the Royal Society of Asian Affairs and to the the Wilson Center for their support and help, and to Shirley, who also helped in putting this together. So the Belt and Road Initiative has been around for over 4 or 5 years now in various manifestations, and it seems to becoming the sort of theme tune, foreign affairs theme tune of the Xi Jinping leadership. And I guess one of the things that we're trying to work out all the time is where the economics and the kind of security issues, where's the boundary between them? And, I mean, are they co-determined? Are they kind of in the same sort of space? So the logic of today's proceedings is this morning we do the easy stuff. We talk about the economics and we talk about how we're all going to make loads of money from the Belt and Road, or according to some of these presentations, how we're all going to lose loads of money from the Belt and Road. And in the afternoon, there'll be more about the security dimensions. So that's the sort of reason for the division. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Shirley Yu. Dr. Yu actually has supported today's event, and she is based in Beijing. She is the Chief Strategic Officer of the Xinyuan Group Limited, and she's advised companies in China, Australia, and United Kingdom and United States. And so she has rich experience of the practical implications of the Belt and Road, but she's also thought a lot about it in an intellectual and a kind of more of an ideological framework. So I would like her to speak for 20, 25 minutes, and then we'll have the other speakers. Okay, thanks so much.
Good morning. As in China, everything will be arranged in a hierarchical order from the juniority to the seniority. So hence I become the first speaker. And I wanted to thank Royal Society of Asian Affairs, the Wilson Center, and Kerry, King's College of London. It's a great honor to be sharing the stage with many China scholars this morning. And I want to thank the audience and also the audience that are watching via live streaming. So I just flew in late last night from Agadir, Morocco, if some of you have been there before. When I was there was never a moment of doubt in my mind that civilizations are diverse. And indeed, there has been many civilizational challenges outside of the Anglo-Saxon West, and occasionally throughout human history, they have once risen, conquered, dominated, surrendered, and disappeared. And this time again, in the first half of the 21st century, a non-Anglo-Saxon power from the East has managed to rise again through its own civilizational history, challenging both the Western liberal market capitalism and the Western political order. The Belt and Road Initiative is essentially a crystallization to center around that theme and to describe the Belt and Road Initiative in a nutshell. It encompasses 66 countries along continental Eurasia and the maritime Asia Pacific. It covers about 40% of the world's GDP and roughly about 63% of the world's population. So by its sheer size and its ambition, the significance of the Belt and Road Initiative cannot be discounted. And living inside China, as Kerry has described, and as a Chinese American, having witnessed the political economic debates on both the East and the West perspective, I'd like to today just to peel off the ideological slogans and the political rhetorics to really talk about the rationale behind the signature foreign policy by Chinese President Xi Jinping's era, and to really demystify the concept. So there are 5 points of the rationale I would like to highlight today. The first one is the Belt and Road Initiative is about economics, but not simply about economics, just as we say that the trade war is about trade, but really, is it just about trade? And so the Belt and Road Initiative is essentially a 2-layered strategy. The first layer is economic. It is using President Xi Jinping's own words for regional countries to jump onto China's economic high-speed rail, or rather it's for regional countries to participate in China's economic prosperity. So that I call the modernization vision. The second layer is political. Again, using Xi Jinping's own words, it's for regional countries to build a community of common destiny. And I would naturally call it the common destiny vision. And so by a mention of a community of common destiny as humankind, it essentially elevates the Belt and Road Initiative to a level almost as significant as the manifest destiny, a defining principle of the American foreign policy. And so the second point, the success of the Belt and Road Initiative is contingent upon the cohesion and the integrity of the achievement of both of the objectives aforementioned. And so if China pumps infrastructure investments into these regional countries and utilizes China's infrastructure development expertise to build these projects, then it would help with the economic development of the recipient countries and therefore lifting the living standards. Infrastructure investments leads to positive economic growth. This is largely congruent with the developmental economics. But then the question becomes, as these countries grow economically, then what? And so this question is essentially a revival of the decades-long debate that started with political scientist Seymour Lipset in his seminal piece in 1959 that basically stated that economic growth leads to political openness, or rather democracy. And so let's together imagine, as China pumps investment dollars into these regional 66 countries, and as these countries economically develop, and then they naturally form a tendency to lean towards democracy, and then they would believe in a whole set of values of the West, and therefore become part of the West, then China would be left alone in this game. There wouldn't be a community of common destiny between China and these regional countries. And so this is neither the intention nor the desirable outcome of Xi's signature foreign policy. And so in that instance, if it were true, then the Belt and Road grand strategy would only succeed at its first objective, which is the modernization objective, but fail at the second, common destiny vision. And so the key really to the success and the failure of the Belt and Road Initiative lies in the integrity and the cohesion and the interconnectedness of achieving both the economic and the political agenda. The third point, the success and the survivability of the Belt and Road Initiative is essentially a test of the China model, and it's predicated upon the political profile of the countries in this region. Empirical research done have shown that the 66 countries that we talked about along this Belt and Road region do not really have a significant tendency to turn towards democracy as they economically develop. This might be disappointing to the liberal world, but it does, in a way, give China the political opportunity to form this community of common destiny. So if we were to look at the political profiles of the 66 countries in this BRI mapping, according to the EIU's global democracy ranking, 2 out of the 66 countries are full democracies. They are Czech Republic and New Zealand. 24 flawed democracies, including countries in Southern Europe, countries in South Asia, 17 hybrid regimes, including countries like Singapore, Turkey, even Iraq, and 23 authoritarian regimes, including the Gulf countries, the North African countries, and the Central Asian, the STANS countries. And so the China model is essentially a model built upon political authoritarianism and a certain degree of economic liberalization, or simply we could categorize it as authoritarian capitalism, because of the natural political profile of the countries in this region being predominantly quasi-democracies, failed democracies, and autocracies. And these countries would actually allow the China model to develop in these countries economically, but at the same time allow the possibility for the political regimes to have a tight grip on their political power. And so when faced with a dire need for economic growth by these regional countries, the countries are offered today a choice between the China model and the Washington consensus model. And I would say that many of these countries, given their political preferences, would actually choose China as a viable partner, and sometimes even as a preferred partner. And so really, the authoritarianism that are predominant in this region, or lack of democracy in this region, really essentially gives China this political incubator to expand its market authoritarianism. And so economically, the success and the survivability of the Belt and Road Initiative is really essentially a competition over market authoritarianism versus market liberalism, and is predicated upon the political preferences of the countries in this region. Number 4, the growth of the Belt and Road investments would naturally lead to China upping its military means in order to protect its assets offshore. And so many of the financial institutions and companies that are involved in Belt and Road investment projects today are primarily state-owned enterprises. And during President Xi Jinping's era, there has been a rise of the weight and scale of state-owned enterprises in Chinese economic scene, as seen by massive activities of mergers and acquisitions to build these colossal business enterprises that are globally too big to fail and virtually uncompetable. And so the SOEs oftentimes are the major players in these Belt and Road projects with a large amount of state backing. Financially, and not much of a worry of financial viability. These SOEs would oftentimes go, in addition to the financial interests, the strategic interests in these Belt and Road projects. And there has been much talk about the debt trap along Belt and Road region. So if there is a financial viability issue in case the projects are not financially sustainable, these SOEs are the ones, the parties that are less concerned. However, much talk has been centered around the debt trap and the financial sustainability by the recipient countries, but little has been talked about of the strategic vulnerability that China would face in this instance. And so let's imagine again that one day when China owns these massive strategic investment projects all across many of the autocracies, dictatorial regimes, and failed democracies along this region, then these countries are bound by no international code to protect the assets and the ownership of these Chinese investments, or to honor the ownership contracts. And so China in this instance will be left with virtually no other means of protection but resort to military means in order to protect its massive investments offshore. And so in other words, as China expands along the Belt and Road region economically and owning significant amount of assets across this region, the worry of military expansion almost becomes an inevitability. And so number 5, if China succeeds in forming its political vision of a community of common destiny, this common destiny would posit a whole set of values that are totally different and sitting on the peripheries of the West. It may encompass nationalism, market authoritarianism, and a code of civil obedience. The community of common destiny is really the third time China has articulated a vision for a world order. The first one was what's called the All Under Heaven through China's imperial times. The second one was rather short-lived. It was by the founding communist China's founding chairman Mao Zedong, to build a class-based global proletariat society. And this is the third time, I think, rather a revival of the ancient notion of all under heaven. So this common destiny, if China were to formulate, would be drawn from the rich repository of ancient Chinese philosophy and its modern political ideology. It's rather a fusion of Confucianism and today's modern political ideology under Chinese characteristics. And so Confucianism did endorse power absolutism and absolute sovereignty. And so through China's imperial history, unlike the West, the emperor's power was not checked by any person or any religion. Rather, as the son of heaven, as we call them, they were only checked by the mandate of heaven, or in its truest sense, his own moral limitations. And so Confucianism did endorse a sense of power absolutism. Confucianism also endorsed or defined the understanding of modern international relations from a Chinese sense. In the Analects, it's stated that the noblemen aim at harmony, not at uniformity. The little men aim at uniformity, not harmony. And so it's the value priority that is placed on harmony over uniformity that defines the modern international relations in China as reflected in the policies of non-interventionism and the peaceful coexistence. So the Western liberalism posits exactly the moral opposite. It is the uniformity that is a priority over harmony. So if we look at the Kantian democratic peace theory, it basically says that democracies and democracies don't fight with each other. And so it is the uniformity, the universal democratic value that is essential to peace, and countries that are not democracies are not trustworthy and therefore are likely to get into war. And so it is really the opposite of Confucianism beliefs. And if we look at Wilsonianism that dominated largely the foreign policy school of the 20th century, is essentially to create uniformity across the nations based on a universal set of values. And so here is a recap of the full rationale of the China's Belt and Road Initiative. It aims to achieve both an economic agenda and a political vision, with China providing infrastructure investments and development expertise into the regional 66 countries. It would help the regional countries to develop economically. And because of the unique political profile of the countries in this region being predominantly quasi-democracies and failed democracies and autocracies, these countries do not exhibit a significant tendency to move towards democracy. And so because they don't fall into the camp of the West, and thus it gives China the political opportunity to form a common destiny. And the common destiny China posit could be born from a fusion of the Confucianism philosophy and the modern Chinese political ideology, and that could be contrary to the Western values of democracy, market liberalism, and civil liberty, and it could encompass values including nationalism, authoritarianism, and civil obedience. So if I'm allowed a little bit of time, I'd like to talk about how this Belt and Road Initiative is going to transform the coming global order. And so essentially the Belt and Road region encompasses two routes. One is the continental Eurasian route, and the other is the maritime Asia-Pacific route. The game changer could most likely happen along continental Eurasia because the US has never been a major dominant player in Eurasian continent, especially in the Eurasian heartland area, either during the Cold War or after the Cold War, either economically or ideologically. So the US had a military stronghold in Afghanistan, but by the military retrieval, the US has volunteered to forsake the strategic position in the Eurasian heartland. And so meanwhile, China's infrastructure development activities are opening up barriers, building up intra-regional trade, and creating new continental realities that could potentially recalibrate the balance of power along the Eurasian continent. Meanwhile, in the maritime Asia-Pacific, power status quo will remain intact for the foreseeable future, as Kissinger would famously say that despite all the verbal spats along South China Sea, it remains largely a security issue, and it'll get resolved one way or another. And so the US has an indisputable military superiority in the maritime Asia-Pacific region. China is the second, and stays a rising second, and China knows fully well, but by a potential challenge to that leadership, it may not bring about a change in that leadership. And so paraphrase, the number one will stay number one, and number two will stay number two in the foreseeable future. However, President Xi Jinping did claim that Asian affairs should be handled by Asians back in 2014. And so that is essentially a claim of the Asian version of the Monroe Doctrine, and it's become quite strong in his stance in the rhetorics with the Taiwan issue. So there are a couple of wild cards out there in maritime Asia-Pacific. So the Eurasian heartland rivalry essentially marked the return of Sir Halford Mackinder's geographical pivot of history in his heartland theory. So back in 1904, Sir Mackinder famously outlined that much of the Eurasian heartland, today really large part of Central Asia and part of Eastern Russia, is the key to the global balance of power. And so he, in his conception, whoever rules this Eurasian heartland commands the world's island, and whoever commands the world island commands the world. And this region, the continental Eurasia heartland, essentially is the world's geographical pivot 100 years ago, as true as it is today. So Mackinder in 1904 also famously defined the two forces of world's geography: the inner crescent of continental powers and the outer crescent of maritime powers. And over the past immediate 6 centuries or so, the outer crescent, the maritime powers, have risen to dominate the world. But over a long period of maybe over 2-3 millennia, before the emergence of the naval powers, really it was the inner crescent, the continental powers, that have dominated the world. And so the competition over Eurasian heartland is essentially a competition between the political powers of the land-based authoritarian states and the naval-based democratic states. And so at the heart of the geopolitical rivalry, there also lies the geo-economic competition over the speed and the efficiency of trade and investment via land route and the sea routes. And from a political philosophical perspective, we could almost say that this is also a competition between the Jeffersonian, egalitarian, liberal order and the Confucius hierarchical authoritarian order. It is a competition between the beacon on the hill versus all under heaven. I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.
Great, well that's a really helpful beginning. So I think we've got the kind of territory mapped out, huge issues from the importance of ideas at the heart of this, Confucianism, and then a kind of search for the validation of this as it's articulated under the current leadership, authoritarianism and the liberal order and the clash between those two, potential clash, and then this idea of common destination. So these are, or common destiny. So these are huge, huge issues. So that's a really good sort of high-level overview. So now I would like to invite Professor Wang Yi-Wei, who's the Jean Monnet Chair Professor and the Director of the Institute of International Affairs and the Director for the Center for European Studies at Renmin University in Beijing, who will talk about the Belt and Road Initiative as a geopolitical strategy. Professor Wang.
Thank you. Oh.
Professor Wang has 120 slides, so you better kind of hold on to your seats.
Takes time.
Perhaps it's used up all its memory.
Maybe say something before. Thank you for the invitation. It's like Shakespeare's saying that 1,000 readers, there were 1,000 Hamlet. So 1,000 people have different views of the Belt Road Initiative. The most important is the Belt Road countries. What do they think about? What is? It's not you think about, it is, I think. In recent 4 years, I traveled to more than 65 countries, which covered nearly all of these the Belt Road countries, to give talks and visit the places that China invests. So maybe I would like to share with my experience that I found from different continents. Oh, finally, thank you. Thank you again. The Belt Road Initiative, many people think about is geopolitics because it comes from the Silk Road, which put forward by German geographer Hitchhofen, 1877. The Europeans think about it as a new Silk Road. The Asian Silk Road is geopolitics. It's Germany who want to have more space under the sun. So that's the reason the misunderstanding comes from. But actually, it's not about the revival of Asian Silk Road, because today's world is changing so rapidly. You cannot repeat history. We just use of the historic memories, but it's about the future. So it's not just continental or maritime. It's more about digital, satellite, beidou, all this, because it's future-oriented. So it's not a strategy. In Chinese, we said it's strategy because the Chinese like to use of this. Domestic, yes, many Chinese developing strategy, but it's not other countries' strategy. You cannot enforce other countries to accept this. We said this is the synergies of strategies. That you have your dream, I have my dream, we let the dream together, great harmony. So that reason the Belt Road Initiative written in the Chinese Communist Party's constitution, not in the People's Republic of China's constitution, because you cannot enforce others to that, as I said. So what is it about? It's about the solution of tomorrow of the world, the challenges. What today's and tomorrow's world, there are more questions about who am I? where we come from, and what's the tomorrow? Actually, the UK have these similar questions, right? Brexit, Great Empire, or whatever. This is a new identity. Turkey, even United States. The many countries suffered of the crisis of the identity. So there are two approaches to solve this problem. One of the US scholars, so-called return to Marco Polo's world, the city-state. Another Marco Polo is the Belt Road Initiative is about go beyond the nation-state. That's the community of the shared future, I think. So it's the Belt Road Initiative is one of the approach to solve today's problem and tomorrow's problem. And the Chinese approach is so-called the He and the He, harmonious and peace. That means community of the shared future. And the He, 合作, cooperation, the mutual connectivity. So like the two sense of the China. So that's the. If you read the very famous Chinese novel, 三国演义, the first sentence is about the unity. It's not about divide. So if you think about the divide and rule, that is not a traditional Chinese culture. Why? Because in China, we have the three major religions, Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism. This is the Confucianism, very famous, saying that also the lady identified the harmonies with the differences. And the Taoism, because of the harmonies between yin and yang. Buddhism we learn from ancient India, but localized as Zen and 佛学. This is 众缘和合. So the three religions, they live peacefully together in traditional Chinese culture. That the three gods, Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism, work together to learn from each other. So the Confucians say, the three people work there, why should be my teacher? That's different with the West. The Western say, the three people work there, I should be their teacher. So I should to learn from each other. If we visit the Shaolin Temple, there's a very famous logo that views like the Buddha and the Confucius and also Taoist, Lao Tzu. So they mix together. This is the harmonies with the He. Another He, 合作, cooperation. That's mutual connectivity. The keywords of the Belt Road Initiative is about mutual connectivity. Today's world is a very hierarchy. It's Western dominated. Start from the political empire and later glories of the Great Britain. Today, like China, the US hub, like Snowden case, and the sanction to Iran, and then all the companies, including China and the US, the Europeans who do business with Iran also be sanctioned by the United States because the SWIFT code on the internet, all this. So the key to understand with this is we also learn from the German history. When Germany was united and then defeated France several times, because if you look at the map, the German's railway system is more mutually connected. The French system is more, all the rails connect to Paris. In today's Africa, the 24 Franco countries, when I visit, it's very astonishing to me that two Franco countries, two neighbors, they should change the flight from Paris and then reach your neighbor. So that's the reason the Africa is so less development. So we should build more mutually connected, like Addis Ababa, now be the regional transportation of air transportation and be the hub, of regional hub. It's not a one hub, it's many hubs. It's not hierarchy, it's about mutual connectivity of that. So there are many authors, like the US, there's also the connectography, who identify that the mutual connectivity is the comparative advantage to every economy. In his books, he identified that the three geography, the natural geography, the political geography, and then the 21st century is a functional geography. It's like London. What kind of role you can play in a global value chain? The more mutual connected, I think that's your competitive advantage. So that's basically the ideas of the Belt Road Initiative. I would like to share with you three best questions. Where it comes from is from the ancient Silk Road, but it's not limited in that. This is Zhenghe, this is, maybe you are very familiar with that. But when the Asian Silk Road was blocked, when the Ottoman Turkey was rising and occupied Istanbul, and then the Europeans needed spice and many things from the east, but they could not get from the continent, so they discovered the world. That's comes of the globalization. But this is basically the maritime globalization, because 90% of the trade volume and 80% of the value of the trade from the sea. So coastal area developed, landlocked areas very poor. So that's the reason 5 years ago when the President Xi visited Kazakhstan, which is the largest landlocked country in the world, put forward the economic Silk Road. The many countries, including international organizations, including the United Nations, put forward the revival of Asian Silk Road, like UNDP, the so-called the Eurasia land bridge, connect East and the West. So China actually is the latest country to put similar ideas to make the revival of the Asian Silk Road, which I think that Hitchhoffen's, one of the famous students of the Swedish, Sven Hardin, in his book, also predicted that China will make the revival of the Asian Silk Road. But now it's not beyond, it's go beyond that because it extends to the South Pacific, Africa, Latin Americans. So there are two means of the Belt Road Initiative. The narrow means is the revival of Asian Silk Road, is the so-called 65 countries, Eurasia continent. The broader meaning is covered now the Latin Americans. Now the more than 150 countries, including international organizations, signed MOU with China. So it's not limited in the Eurasia continent. So what's it about? It's about mutual connectivity through the land, sea, air, internet, and energy, all kinds of the mutually connected. At least covered at the beginning of the Eurasia, 6 economic corridors. So it's about, firstly about infrastructure. Because so many people, you live in the poor countries, landlocked countries, they suffered a lot with the poor of infrastructure. The new liberalism, globalization, which off capital, by capital, and for capital, knows an interest to focus on the infrastructure building because it costs lots of money, not make profits in the short term. And then now's the Chinese comparative advantage because we have the most populist in the world and also most advanced infrastructure building capacity, state-owned enterprises, and because Chinese people also work very hard. I think the most importantly, China has the most independent, complete industries, sectors in today's world. So we can build from the silk to satellite, nearly everything. So that's the most efficient in doing so. Live the poverty in the short past 40 years. China lived the poverty of more than 700 million people, which contributed to the world more than 70%. Many developing countries want to share this experience. So the Chinese people say, build the road if you want to get rich. If you want to get rich quickly, build the motor road. If you want to get rich immediately, build the internet road, Alibaba, to have you. So that's the developing countries want to share experience. For the developed countries like UK, because industrialization happened 100 years ago, so your infrastructure also relatively poor. You really need to renovate. The US, the rail system is also very poor. Because the capital also interest. Because the democracy, you said democracy, the politicians focus on the short term, 4 years maximum, or even several months. So cannot focus on the long-term infrastructure building. But today's world is the informationalization, digitalization of the infrastructure, like a digital port. But this costs lots of money. So I think that's the key for the building more mutually connected from the air, port, railway, all this. So that's a revolution. Mutually connectivity with the industrialization of the informationalization, digitalization of the infrastructure network. Second meaning of the Belt Road Initiative. When you think about the Belt Road, the infrastructure building not make money, why China interest? It's about the cluster of industries. For instance, in Indonesia, which has more than 70,000 islands, the one with the biggest populous island is called Java, which have more than 100 million people. Very young, dynamic, but poor infrastructure. They want to build the high-speed railway connect the capital, Jakarta, to Bangkok, but no money. And then Chinese companies and the Japanese companies bid for this railway. And the Japanese companies failed because the Indonesian government cannot provide the credit for this investment because it's a private company and then failed. And the Chinese, there has the Chinese developing financing, Guokaihang, who be creditor of this project. And then asked the more Chinese companies to not just build this railway, but also the logistic, all the rail ester along this along this rail. And then makes huge money. For instance, Guizhou is one of the poorest provinces in China. By recent years, the economic growth is most rapidly 2-digit still because of the high-speed railway. So China, in the past 10 years, we built nearly 30,000 high-speed railway. The high-speed railway, 1 kilometer, that costs 100 million yuan. So 30,000, that means 6 trillion yuan. If the economists predict the Chinese economy will collapse, the debts will be huge. But this is wrong, because if you consider about the sell the tickets to make money of the rail, this is not true. If they build the two cities with the high-speed railway that connect each other, and then logistic, poverty, the lift, and the tourists, all this booming is cluster of the industries. So Chinese economy will really integrate single market, even more single market in the logistics than the European Union because of the high-speed railway system. Okay, this is about a second. So it still make money in the long term, not short. And the third meaning of the Belt and Road Initiative about economic corridors. It's also a China experience shared with other developing countries. When like the Shenzhen and the Guangzhou and all these cities connect each other of the economic corridors, and then have the Yangtze Pearl River economic delta. And also we have Shanghai, the Yangtze River economic delta, and the two driving forces for Chinese economy takeoff. And then it's about the single market. It's about the free flows of the capital, humans, and currency, and all kinds of this. So basically, we learn from the European integration, but go beyond the European integration. Because European integration, first, you transfer the sovereignty to the Brussels, which cannot agree with the poor countries, very sensitive to that. Second, European integration is a very high standard, all high standard. The Chinese approach, yes, high standard, but there are 65 countries, 500 million of them without electricity, 100 million of them without clean water, 16 of them not joined WTO, 8 of them LDC countries like Nepal and Afghanistan. So how can those make those diverse developed countries to have the high standard, the single standard? So China's approach is we should have the let the regional different countries, they have their own comfortable approach to join globalization. Make the globalization localized. It's like China. We also have the very diverse poor provinces and very advanced like Shanghai and Beijing and Shenzhen. So this is a China experience, I think. And also different with the US. The US approach is exclusive. The TPP, TTIP, EBC, everyone but China. The Chinese approach is inclusive. As we identified the Chinese culture, Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism. This is, I think, we learned from the experience of advanced economy, but something go beyond that. So domestically for China is integrated with the Chinese market. At the same time, the bring Chinese prosperity will benefit to our Chinese neighbors through the mutual connectivity, logistic infrastructure, and also trade. And extend to Europe, that the China-Europe Rail Express, and then connect each other, including London and to EU. To the north, Mongolia is the second largest landlocked country in the world. 1 kilometer, nearly 1 person, so poor, but the raw materials is very rich. To the south, this is the most controversial, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. This is called flagship. Why is it called that? Because all the Central Asian countries, they need access to the ocean, Indian Ocean, not just the Xinjiang benefit. There are 4 pillars. One of the pillars is the Guadalajara port, which is 120 kilometers away from the Hormuz Strait. It's very unique. Second is infrastructure building. Third, energy independent. Pakistan, whenever we visit Pakistan, Karachi, the biggest populous city, every year, because without electricity, 1,000 people will die, hot season. But now, 2020, the Pakistan energy will be independent. The Silk Road Fund, the first project is for the hybrid plant. The fourth pillar is about the economic zone, industrial park, all this. According to the mid-long term, the Pakistan economy will take off 6 years ago from the 3.5%. Last year, it's 5.8% economic growth. This is a failed state in the eyes of the Western media, but now have the future. 2030, Pakistan economy will be mid-power in the world. So this is remarkable achievements. Now extend to Afghanistan. The first time when the United Nations Security Council endorsed the Belt and Road Initiative because we stand to Afghanistan. This, the lifted poverty and the reduced the terrorists is good for the United States, for Europe, definitely. So, and then also including India, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and Myanmar, and China economic corridor. And because India so very low efficiency. And then another economic corridor, the China-Myanmar. It's about energy. It's also about to help the Yunnan access to the Indian Ocean. And the Indo-China economic corridors. The Mahathir, they have initiated 30 years ago about the Pan-Asia rail system. Now connected all the 7 Indo-China continental countries that are access to, including the high-speed railway in the future. And also about the soft infrastructure, like the RCEP, all this, but like the intensive progress. There are many other countries also have the logistic, energy, and mutual connectivity plans. So the Belt and Road Initiative is focused on the synergies of the strategies, including Russia's Far Eastern, and also the North Pole, now because of climate change. To build more mutual connectivity, including the United States, 2011 also put up the new Silk Road strategy, withdraw troops from Afghanistan. All these connect each other. We can reach the systematic effect of the Eurasia more mutually connected. But of course, it cannot compare to the European Union high level, but it's 1 + 1 more than 2 effect. These originally covered the so-called 65 countries. But now it's go beyond that, as I said. So to summarize the Belt and Road Initiative, firstly, is about the community of the shared future on the basis of the shared interests and the shared responsibility. Second is about the continental and the maritime mutually connected, and also the satellite and the internet. The third pillar, the principles, we said build of all, build by all, build for all. It's not to enforce others to do that. Indians actually, they factually participate in many projects, but vertically, rhetorically, they reject or criticize. The 4 kinds of the Silk Road is about the green, health, smart, peace. Because this is the 21st century. You cannot pollute first and then kill, like China made a mistake before. So it's 5 pillars. Start from the policy oriented, because the FTA, we should consult with the government what kind of projects you need. So policy. And then facilities, both the trade and financial cooperation, because I think we should London be the R&D International Clean Center to contribute for that. And people-to-people exchange. And the 6 economic corridors, this identified before, so we go. And also maritime Silk Road is about the blue, the green partnership that go beyond the logic in the continent. And finally, where are we going? This is the key to understand the Belt and Road Initiative, the open reform 40 years. China has always highlighted the relation between China and the advanced economy, but now the more competition with them. That's the reason we have the trade war. And then, but the Belt and Road countries, which live in the 30, 40 years ago of China. So China's experience is very fresh to them, industrialization, urbanization, and help them not to repeat the tragedy that China did in the past, and lift the poverty and contribute to reach the global balance. I think that's the very important the China initiative. Those countries is relatively poor, but huge potential for economic growth. It's like 40 years ago of China. 40 years ago, China's per capita GDP is only 1/3, even less, of the Sahara South African poorest countries. But after 40 years, we are number 2 world economy and the ranking number 60. So that's the China experience. From they have suffered of the poor infrastructure, particularly from the power and the multi-road and telecom and port and all this. According to McKinsey, there is a multiplier effect of the infrastructure building. When the $1 trillion of the infrastructure building can bring with of the $2.5 trillion of the GDP, and then contribute to more than 70 and 80,000 jobs for the world. And then because the mutually connected, it's horizontal, it's not different, it's not hierarchy, so it's more efficient to lift of the productive force. And then contribute to the world economy with more than 10 to 15%, which maximum 5% the previous globalization. By 2050, they contribute to 80% of the world economy growth, well, and also for bringing with the 3 new billion middle class for the world. This is about China, China real, China US, China Europe real, connect each other. So the mission is about rebalance of the world economy growth from the continental to the continental and maritime, mutually connected. This is today's world, they live in the dark. Those many countries still live in the darkness. More than 1.1 billion people still without electricity. India, the largest populist, with more than 300 million without electricity, suffered a lot. And then there's the US think tank, that all the projects, particularly in Africa, when China invests, and then it's not living in the darkness anymore, the brightness coming. So first, so change that situation. And the internet, definitely is US, Europe are more mutually connected. The other countries still live without, half of the world population without access to internet. 80% of the world people live in the developing countries. So those countries, I think, cannot be marginalized by the globalization. Otherwise, make more terrorists, make more refugees for the world. So that's the reason the Belt and Road Initiative is so welcome in those countries. In the past 5 years, China invested more than $80 billion now, and also created many jobs. And actually, this is the update of the 82 overseas economic and trade cooperation zones. And then come back to the Europe. The many Europeans predict that the Europeans' future and destiny is not just rely on the transatlantic, but also Eurasia continent. So this is the #1 trade partner of China in Europe. In total, the world, more than 130 countries, number one trade partner is China, including Brazil. So that's the reason the Belt and Road Initiative 5 years ago was put forward, particularly to deal with the global financial crisis. For the Europe, first, these, I think, 8 opportunities, economic growth. Europeans suffered, even this year, the German's economy also, people think about coming to the recession is a big problem of that. Second, to make the revival of the civilization and the regional integration, particularly 16+1, the poor, you have the bridges, east and west, south and north, and the new and the old members. And the China-US European cooperations will be more comprehensive, and also help you for the reconciliation with Russia, because you cannot choose your neighbor, and also help the European Union access to Asia-Pacific. And also global influence of the Europe, like the Asian Silk Road. The balance, you have more choice, not just rely on the transatlantic. I think this 16+1, and then Greece, and all this signed the MOU with China. Now even other countries like Ukraine also want to join, Greece, even Italy. Okay, the third-party markets now is also highlight because you have so many English-speaking countries in Africa and in the world. International capacity corporations, joint development, maritime Silk Road. So the conclusion for Europe is the more mutually connected with China through the Euro-Asia continent, like Albert Einstein identified. Of course, there are many challenges. There are 3 forces in today's world. The Europe is more about the norms. US is about original innovation. China is marketization. It's like AI. Germany is also very advanced. But Germany told them, because they need a big market, China very efficient practicing technology. So electronic vehicles, AI, both US and Europe need Chinese market. Because China will have more than 800 million netizens. The Chinese people work so hard. The right hand eat, left hand WeChat. So you both hands, knife and fork cannot so quickly. And then that's the reason China's digital economy, I think it's combined US and Europe together. And also the civilizations of the Islam. There are many so-called the classic civilizations. In today's world, actually, the Islam focuses on the man and God. China, man and man. And Christianity, religions, man and nature, very efficient. In today's world, we should have the trinity of the man, nature, and the God. All this should hand over. So 65 countries, more than half of them, Islam country, Muslim countries. The 6 most populous. So the Belt and Road Initiative is solve the problem with the most advanced, most dynamic, most young population rising from the Islam. If you cannot give jobs to them in Africa, in Islam country, you make troubles for you. I think this is very important. The Chinese labor intensive and factories move to those countries, build more railway, connect each other. Okay, so risks, of course. There are 4 kinds of risks. No, I know, no, I know, don't know, maybe, okay. Let's go rapidly. Different economic systems, depths, if people think about the political, security, is unstable. This is 1960, China built the Karakoram Road in Pakistan, in the Himalaya, 5,000 meters higher, cannot breathe. So China sent 30,000 workers there, and more than 700 Chinese workers died for this road. Okay, and then, so legal systems, different legal systems, morality, many. So how to deal with the risks? Of course, we should work together. It's not Chinese job, it's joint responsibilities. And then there are many questions about the environment. I think they use one good case with there is the GEI, Global Energy Initiative, to connect all this to provide electricity for those countries while cut CO2 emission. It works. In the Katowice climate change conference, the organization initiative that cut CO2 emission while providing energy for the poor countries. That's like the Chinese traditional medicine. Second, debts. The reason many people question about the debts is like give the chicken to you, and if you eat the chicken, and then you own debts to China. But Chinese approach is give the chicken to you, let the chicken have the eggs. Eggs have more chickens, and the chickens have more eggs. In the future, the eggs pay back, no debts. So infrastructure building, think about the long term. So that's like third question about transparency. Many of the bilateral, so that we should have the summit to have a more multilateral. Geopolitics, I say, is no. Social responsibility. There are many criticisms about the Chinese not hire local workers. At the beginning, yes, because the Chinese workers work harder and easygoing because of the language. But now, the local workers, the price is just 1/2 or even less than Chinese workers. Why not hire them? You need training them, need time to training them. Corruption, like AIIB, clean, green, and lean, I think. So the Belt Road Initiative now is called the clean, we say the highlights. New colonialism, the any colonialism build the roads for you and the industry helped to you get industrialized, not Marshall Plan. Marshall Plan is one dimension, it's geopolitics, divide. The Belt Road Initiative is about investment. It's about mutual connectivity, definitely different sense. It's a rule-based or development-oriented. Yes, of course, rule-based. But I said, the Belt Road countries is so diverse. You cannot have one approach to adapt to all. We should gradually to reach the consensus. It's not just no Chinese hub, no anyone. China cannot replace US or somebody else. It's like who defeated Nikon? It's not Samsung, it's smartphones. So who defeated US? It's not China or somebody else. It's about the new products, new way of producing. So China, I think, focus on that. For more, I have several books. First is 3 years ago in the London Book Fair, and many other languages, and the UNESCO, United Nations. So the Western model traditionally is the burden, when the US first, and then big problem. The Chinese approach is like that. Solves for the people. So I think think about that, and then can solve the problem. Thank you.
Good. Great. So that was a Beijing view, which was very appreciated. Of the connectivity, a lot of visualization of the connectivity, which is very impressive. An idea with deep historic roots, so it's not new, it's not come from nowhere. And the kind of discussion of these different sorts of spaces, so not just a physical space, but a virtual space, economic space, and an ideological, a space of ideas. So now I would like to ask for Arif Rafiq. He's a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute and president of Vizier Consulting, a political risk advisory company specializing in the Middle East and South Asia. And he will address the issue of the China-Pakistan economic corridor, the lure of easy financing and the perils of poor planning. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brown, for that introduction, and good morning to you all. So I'd like to express my gratitude to the Royal Society for Asian Affairs and the Woodrow Wilson Center for organizing this event and inviting me to take part. I'll be discussing the China-Pakistan economic corridor and its impact on the Pakistani economy and polity, and the lessons it may provide for the broader Belt and Road Initiative. Pakistan, as it is implied in much of the media reporting these days, serves as an interesting case study of the impact of China's Belt and Road Initiative, given the scale and importance of CPEC and the unique nature of the China-Pakistan relationship. The two countries have had a robust diplomatic and defense relations since the late 1960s. Economic ties, however, have remained weak. So CPEC marked the start of a venture into uncharted waters with respect to the bilateral relationship. At the outset, when CPEC was formally launched in 2015, 82% of Pakistanis had a favorable opinion of China, according to a poll by the Pew Global Attitudes Project. And the only country that had a more favorable opinion of China was China itself. So given the strength of the strategic partnership and the favorable opinions of China in Pakistan, at least at the aggregate level, this was a unique starting point when compared to other BRI countries that have had a more ambivalent approach or perspective on China. Many of the barriers to success in other BRI countries simply do not exist, or at least did not exist in Pakistan. But there are also some overlapping and similar challenges in Pakistan, and some that are unique to the country itself. So what I will do here is I will, one, provide a brief overview of what CPEC is, then address some of its achievements and shortcomings, and then offer some comment on what might need to be done along the road to rectify some of CPEC's weak points. So what is CPEC? CPEC, according to official documents, is a connectivity project that aims to link Kashgar in China's landlocked western region of Xinjiang with Pakistan's Arabian Sea coast, which is home to two established ports, Karachi and Port Qasim, and the Chinese-operated port of Gwadar. The CPEC portfolio has been said to consist of projects totaling upwards of $62 billion in cost. This is a fluid figure, and Pakistan may not have the capacity to absorb this entire amount of aid and investment over the short-term period. What is more important is the amount of aid and investment that has actually come into the country through CPEC, and as I'll discuss in a moment, this figure is actually quite considerable. Roughly 70% of these potential projects, potential expenditures are for electric power projects, most of which are coal-fired plants. They're regarded as private investment, though there are sovereign guarantees, and Chinese state-owned enterprises play the role of independent power producers supplying electricity to Pakistan's public utility companies. So it's private investment, but there is a governmental role on both sides. The idea is, or at least was, to address Pakistan's electric power deficit and inefficiencies in its ground infrastructure, and then pave the way for investments in the country's agricultural and industrial sectors. There are, however, complications along that road, which I'll address in detail. So presently, $18.9 billion in CPEC projects have been initiated or completed, according to the Chinese embassy in Islamabad. Now, that includes two sets of coal-fired power plants that presently provide electricity to the grid in Pakistan, and both projects were completed in short time. So CPEC is clearly one of the more advanced Belt and Road linked corridors, at least with respect to the total cost of, total value of initiated and completed projects. And I think it's important to remind ourselves of the context in which CPEC was initiated and launched. During this period, from 2013 to 2015, Pakistan had seen a resurgence of anti-state jihadist networks and was in the midst of a failed process of negotiations with the anti-state militant network, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. Then in 2014, the Pakistan Army launched Operation Zarb-e-Azb in the middle part of 2014 and largely cleared the remaining sort of hotspots of militancy in the tribal areas. But that year ended with a horrific school massacre in Peshawar, and yet since then we've seen terrorist attacks drop precipitously each year in Pakistan. And last year terrorist attacks had reached their lowest levels in about 15 years. But in 2013, Pakistan was regarded as one of the world's most dangerous countries, and some still may regard it as such, but the data points otherwise. But few were willing to invest in it. And so CPEC at that point in time had served as a critical morale booster for Pakistan because it was a country where few countries were willing to invest in. So that $18.9 billion figure demonstrates that CPEC has been an effective medium through which to fast-track the completion of infrastructure projects. And that portfolio of projects that are in the CPEC, that constitute the CPEC portfolio, have been on Pakistan's wish list for quite some time. So some of these projects were actually, I noticed they were on a list of potential projects that USAID was considering funding in the 1990s. So, so there's been quite some time that's passed since then. So the reason why Pakistan has failed to push forward a lot of these projects is because of the significant legal, political, and security risks the country poses to foreign investors. There's also the problem of a colonial-era designed bureaucracy that is ill-equipped to serve as a facilitating or catalyzing force in today's global economy. So through this ad hoc bilateral framework via CPEC, we've had projects achieve financial close and even become operational at a speed not typically associated with a country like Pakistan. And several of the projects have been completed much earlier than one would see pretty much in any other country except for China. So the major completed projects were launched and completed during the tenure of the previous government, which completed its run in May of last year, and that was the Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz Party. Several key projects were located in or even sponsored by a provincial government run by that party. The province is known as Punjab, and they were personally directed by the Chief Minister, Shahbaz Sharif. And so a phrase was coined to characterize this rapid completion of projects. It was called Punjab speed. The inference was that the province of Punjab was able to match the speedy delivery that has largely been associated with infrastructure projects in China. And so Punjab speed had met China's speed. But speed itself is not necessarily a good thing. Punjab speed was motivated by political priorities, and it actually became a liability due to, unfortunately, typically poor Pakistani planning. The previous government's timeline was electoral. It sought to complete major projects before the 2018 elections, and the Pakistani economy was unable to absorb this amount of investment in this short period of time, which required the import of heavy machinery for some of these electric power and infrastructure projects. Pakistan is also a net energy importer, so the rise in commodity prices and energy prices from 2016 into much of this year also put strain on Pakistan's current account, and so its foreign exchange reserves plunged, putting the country on the verge of a balance of payments crisis. So now Pakistan, to avoid a balance of payments crisis, is in talks with the IMF for a bailout. And this would be for the 22nd time in its history that it's had to go to the IMF for a bailout. And it has received or will receive short-term assistance from China, Saudi Arabia, and the United Emirates, and it's attempting to pair this short-term lending with foreign direct investment from these very sources. But the Pakistani economy will once again slow. Public spending is being heavily cut. The rupee has been devalued on several occasions over the past year. Interest rates and inflation are rising, and now annual growth is estimated to slow over the short term from a rate of around 6% to below 4%. So Punjab speed via CPEC, it could be said, actually served as an accelerant to Pakistan's boom-bust cycles that we've seen over the past few decades. This has prevented Pakistan from achieving long-term sustained growth as compared to regional countries like Bangladesh and India. So while CPEC gave momentum to a country where governance has largely been associated with lethargy, the lure of easy project financing also clouded the decision-making of public policymakers, pulling Pakistan away from a path of responsible economic planning. In the immediate term, it strengthened the disequilibrium in the Pakistani economy rather than serving as a transformative force as it is intended. So continuing with the question of transformation, CPEC may have also disincentivized reform, particularly in the power sector, but also with respect to the judiciary. So Pakistan's previous government focused on ramping up power generation and reshaping the country's fuel mix. But once CPEC gained momentum, the government lagged on combating theft of electricity and transmission and distribution losses in the grid. The grid itself is still unable to handle 19 or 20,000 megawatts of electric power, but now generating capacity far exceeds that. So energy sector reform, including dealing with liquidity problems in the power sector, has also stalled. Intercompany arrears within the electricity system continue to add up, and Pakistan has struggled to pay some of the CPEC independent power producers, which are effectively Chinese state-owned enterprises, whose projects are now supplying electricity to the grid in Pakistan. As Pakistan's installed power capacity grows, so do the indirect liabilities of the Pakistani government, which has to largely pay for these arrears and intercompany arrears within the system. And so if generating capacity grows, so do those potential liabilities. So while power supplied through CPEC may bring down electric power tariffs in Pakistan, it is actually more expensive or on par with Pakistan's competitors, especially when factoring in the incentives or heavy subsidies or effective subsidies provided to Chinese companies. So Pakistani consumers will continue to struggle to afford the electricity that is offered to them. And Pakistani electric companies will struggle to collect payment and arrears. Realistic pricing of electricity, keeping Pakistani income levels in mind, is critical to electric sector reform. Unfortunately, these the previous government was focused mainly on increasing installed capacity as opposed to reforming the power sector. And Chinese state-owned enterprises were focused on maximum profit generation with guaranteed returns on investment of 30% or more for many of these projects. So continuing with the subject of reform, much of the success of CPEC, at least from a project management perspective, is due to ad hoc parallel structures created to facilitate Chinese aid and investment. But we've yet to see an effort to reform the overall judicial system and improve the investment environment, especially when it comes to contract enforcement. CPEC has addressed much of the uncertainty by doing away with open bidding, providing easy access to project financing, and enabling the redressal of concerns and grievances through an ad hoc bilateral framework, and offering Chinese companies informal preferential access to Pakistani decision makers. But for non-Chinese investors, Pakistan remains a market with a high degree of legal and political risk. And so that's why we've seen an uptick in foreign direct investment from China, at least from state-owned enterprises, but not sustained investment from elsewhere. So there isn't that compound effect that had been expected when CPEC was launched. Now we are actually likely to see a rise in FDI from Saudi Arabia and the UAE this year in Pakistan. But the impetus for that may be geopolitics as opposed to domestic economic reforms. Pakistan's outgoing Supreme Court Chief Justice has discussed creating an arbitration system for foreign investors similar to the system that exists in the UAE, but we've yet to see political leaders initiate a dialogue, let alone prepare legislation on such reforms. We've also seen Pakistani regulatory authorities weaken as a result of political and diplomatic pressure to push CPEC forward. It's these entities that should be independent from external influence, and improving their capacity and capabilities is key to improving overall governance in the country. So as we enter CPEC's fourth year, it can be said that the surge in Chinese investment has contributed to an economic bubble in Pakistan, and to prevent that bubble from bursting, the new government has little choice but to slow the economy, recalibrate spending priorities, and push forward systemic reforms. But I think it's important to keep in mind a longer-term view when we look at CPEC as well as the Belt and Road. Past is not necessarily prologue, and if these long-delayed reforms in Pakistan, whether it's to the taxation system, to the electric power sector, and to the bureaucracy itself, are actually implemented over the next 3 to 5 years, we could actually identify CPEC as one of the contributing factors or catalysts for reform in Pakistan. So while CPEC has likely induced Pakistan's likely return to the IMF later this year, if Pakistan is able to push forward many of these reforms due to coaxing or pressure from the IMF, as well as indirect guidance from China, CPEC may have actually induced some reforms that have been delayed over the past few decades. Speaking of the future, moving ahead, CPEC will actually have to be retrofitted with an actual economic master plan. There is a CPEC long-term plan that was released in 2017, but what we've seen is that it's largely a notional plan that is uninformed by a comprehensive feasibility study and economic forecasting. The CPEC long-term plan is merely aspirational. It consists of 3 phases that stretch over the next 15 years, but it's now obvious that it does not actually guide decision-making by officials in China and Pakistan. Several developments make this clear. One, there is no clarity on what is the firm basis for the inclusion or exclusion of projects from the CPEC portfolio. These factors are neither explicitly stated, nor can they always be inferred. Many of these projects are obviously relate to connectivity between the two countries, but then, for example, there are also metro rail projects that are municipal, that provide connectivity within a given city in Pakistan, but have really no relevance to regional economic connectivity. Then there are also Chinese-funded electric power projects that are ongoing in Pakistan, but not included in the CPEC portfolio. And then there are also road projects that are part of the CPEC ground network, but are not funded through CPEC or even formally included as part of CPEC. In fact, some of these projects are wholly funded by the government of Pakistan. So ultimately, the question of does it mean for a project to be included as part of CPEC has yet to be clearly defined. And as I'll discuss in a bit, that has led to a sort of bloating of the CPEC portfolio and a lack of focus. Two, if industrialization is actually the main goal of CPEC, these relatively high electric power tariffs don't do Pakistan any good in terms of achieving competitiveness with regional peers. And this is in spite of the enormous incentives that have been provided to Chinese state-owned enterprises. Three, there is a great deal of ambiguity and uncertainty surrounding overland trade between China and Pakistan. But a great deal of money is actually being spent on this connectivity. So the Karakoram Highway, which was displayed in a previous presentation, is being realigned so it can handle faster traffic. And Pakistan is taking upwards of $2 billion in loans to realign this highway, which serves a single purpose at this point, which is to connect the two countries over land, but most of their trade is actually conducted by sea. So, what type of future economic activity justifies this $2 billion expenditure? We've yet to see investment from China in industrial centers that would lie along this northern corridor inside Pakistan. That money perhaps would have been better spent in a city like Karachi, which is Pakistan's largest city. It's an industrial hub and also home to, the region is home to its two largest ports. And the city presently lacks mass transportation. So I think, there's a lack of a clear rationale for why these projects why this amount of money is being invested in these projects. Continuing on this theme, we speak of a China-Pakistan economic corridor, but we don't know, but we only know of the investments that are happening on the Pakistani side. What's being constructed on the Chinese side, and how will Pakistan be impacted by the internment of upwards of 1 million Uyghur Muslims? Can this area be linked to Pakistan? Can this area really serve as a hub of regional economic activity? And as we look at the future and stability of that region, is that $2 billion a wise investment? The economist of Pakistan's Planning Commission during the previous government had presented a fantastically absurd estimate of $6 to $8 billion in annual toll revenue and fees that Pakistan would earn through CPEC. He said that would begin in around 2020. And he had estimated that over $100 billion in China's global trade would be routed through CPEC by 2020. Now, it's important to keep in mind that by comparison, in the Jebel Ali Free Zone in Dubai in 2016, $80 billion in non-oil trade passed through that area. So, that's one of the world's top 10 container ports. So, to make up that much ground in 2 years seems to me to be quite implausible. Now, some of the CPEC projects do make sense. A high-speed, controlled access highway that connects Pakistan's two largest cities, Karachi and Lahore, makes absolutely perfect sense. But even with that, we don't have realistic estimates of traffic volume and toll revenue that would be generated. So Pakistan has just kind of pushed forward with these projects, but as we've seen, it's not really on a path of sustainable growth. So CPEC will have to be retrofitted with an overarching plan that partly tries to leverage the infrastructure that has or will be coming online. A year-long period to revisit and retune CPEC, as had been suggested by an advisor to the new Pakistani Prime Minister on trade, was a perfectly sensible suggestion, but for political and diplomatic reasons, it was shot down. So, despite this, the metrics for judging the progress in CPEC, the metrics for judging the progress in CPEC will also have to change. Since its genesis, the main metric so far has simply been the size of CPEC. So the project began at around $46 billion and then ballooned to $62 billion. And Pakistani officials in the previous government had continuously boasted about the growing size of the CPEC portfolio, though as the portfolio grows, so do their challenges and their liabilities. Pakistan had effectively put itself in a position where it was competing with its own self. The true impact of CPEC should be determined by its impact on job creation, on logistics efficiency, on productivity, and export volume. The present government in Islamabad appears to be retooling CPEC along these lines, but the opposition, including ministers from the previous government who had helped initiate and manage CPEC, are now accusing the new government of reducing the size of CPEC by canceling or deferring some projects. So there are those political compulsions that may cause some temptation or force or compel the present government to not remove some projects that are not economically viable. The losers of this process may be Pakistan's smaller provinces. When CPEC was launched, the set of projects, the portfolio was distributed mainly towards the country's existing industrial hubs and population centers, which are mainly in the largest province in Punjab. And this resulted in protests from the smaller provinces. Now, to address the concerns of these smaller provinces, China and Pakistan added projects to the CPEC portfolio in December of 2017. And these included road and metro rail projects in these smaller provinces that are just not economically sustainable at this point. They're not economically viable. And even right now, when we look at industrial zones that are supposed to be part of the next stage of CPEC, in the Punjab province, Pakistan's largest and most prosperous province, these industrial zones have struggled to secure supplies of gas and electricity. These projects in these smaller provinces are likely to be on the chopping block, and we'll even see projects that are in the largest province of Punjab struggle to move forward. So I think we're probably going to see discontent over the very fairness of CPEC reemerge. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for that very comprehensive and well-informed overview of one of the most difficult areas. When you get to the detail of the Belt and Road, of course, that's when things become interesting. So the point you made about what does it mean to be part of these big ideas and what actually happens, that's very important. The very sensitive issue of Xinjiang and what is actually happening there and the way that relates to the relationship between Pakistan and China, of course, and others. And your final question about the winners and losers, extremely important. There's always winners and losers in any of these things, and an idea of that. So it kind of creates some of the knowledge of some of the complexity of what behind China's ambition. Of course, there are things that are laudable, but also issues about who gains and who loses. So for the final presentation in this session, I'm very glad to invite James Schwemlein. He is a former US diplomat, now non-resident scholar the Southeast Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and a consultant for the World Bank on South Asia. And he will be talking about Flawed by Design, examining pockets of resistance to BRI projects. James.
Sure. Thank you, Professor Brown. I just want to start by saying, and now for something completely different, to quote philosopher John Cleese. My background is in policy, not in academia, so I'm going to have a slightly different focus. I will focus on looking at the periods of local resistance to the BRI, and in particular in illiberal democracies. I think these illiberal states are actually bellwethers for looking at indicators of where the new global competitive framework is headed. They're states that are characterized by weak institutions, but regimes that experience accountability through regular elections and through a degree of representation of local views. So I look at three cases. Pakistan, which I won't dwell on too long after the excellent work of my friend Arif Rafiq, Sri Lanka, and Malaysia. I could have looked at many more. As Shirley said earlier, the illiberal democracies actually make up the bulk of BRI beneficiaries. I focus on these three in this instance because they're the ones where the scope of China's efforts are most formed and most advanced in a lot of ways. We could talk about the Maldives or Bangladesh or Nepal or Indonesia, the list goes on, but I'll look at these three. So in each of these cases, in each of the three cases that I'm going to look at, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Chinese investments have been met with a degree of turbulence emanating from political transitions, which I think is a notable characteristic. I do want to start by clarifying what I mean by pushback. I apply a very narrow definition revolving around efforts to amend, renegotiate, or cancel contracts or initiatives previously agreed or announced by Beijing and the local capital. I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that other people use pushback differently. Sometimes it's applied, I think, wishfully, as a means of highlighting instances of local resistance as a strategic rebuke of Beijing's rise. That's not what's happening. I don't think there's any evidence of a beneficiary of a BRI country saying no to Beijing and meaning no to Beijing as hell no or go away. Beijing remains one of the fastest growing economies in the world and will shortly be the most important economy in Asia for every single Asian country if it's not already. Countries are saying no tactically, they're not saying no strategically. And I say particularly to my former colleagues back in Washington that to confuse the two is a really important mistake. Just because people say no in the short term doesn't mean they're saying no in absolute terms forever. And that we have to cope with the reality of China's rise, not what we wish were happening. And that reality is highlighted in these instances of illiberal democracy. Many of the BRI initiative or the Belt and Road Initiative efforts have been dogged by allegations of corruption. I don't think either of my colleagues on the stage would actually contest that. Part of that is because Beijing tends to overlook local governance and seek alternate ways around local institutions. That allows it to operate expediently in states with weak institutions. It makes sustainability difficult, as I think many of our countries have learned through hard experience. So when we look at instances of pushback, I'm going to look at two factors. First, what do these instances tell us about China's evolving operating model as it emerges? So I'm going to highlight three factors that I think are common across cases in terms of the experience of recipients. And second, what are the lessons that the rest of us should take from it, from these instances, and as we think about, from a policy perspective, responding to China's rise. So first, I'm going to talk about Pakistan, and I'll keep it brief after Arif's excellent presentation. One element that Arif didn't dwell on is the reality that Pakistan's army dominates political life. That's the main tenet that makes Pakistan illiberal, is even in periods of democracy, the military is the dominant institution wherever the military wants to be. That close military relationship between China and Pakistan is the bedrock on which all of the China-Pakistan relationship is built. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is a dramatic upgrade of the economic element, but it doesn't shift the underlying military reality. Where the Chinese have wanted access, where the Chinese have wanted to do things, or wanted Pakistani experience or expertise, they've always been told yes. The reverse is not true. China has not always responded when Pakistan requests its support, but in terms of the one-way relationship, Pakistan's army has been a remarkably loyal partner for the PLA. The pushback, as Arif kind of characterized and agreed with, against China's efforts in Pakistan have been around three areas of concern. First, opaque procurement processes and term sheets. Second, limited opportunities for local participation. This is particularly highlighted by private sector firms. It was highlighted before CPEC. It's been highlighted throughout. And third, the unequal distribution of benefits among groups and local actors. I'd say this extends not just in the regional and geographic distribution, which Arif characterized very well, but also among political actors for the fruits of the contract. That it's not just a matter of Lahore or Karachi or Peshawar, it's also a matter of which power group receives the benefits. This is the main tension between the previous government and Pakistan's army, was over who controls the benefit of CPEC, or one of the main tensions. So these areas of concern and grievance and pushback are reflected in the public political space and also by the army. And it's no surprise that they were all features of Imran Khan's successful campaign for the election of his party last summer. He was seated in August as a rookie prime minister. I think the national consensus around these grievances in Pakistan is notable. But the other notable element is that Pakistan's weak institutions have been unable to respond to the grievances. They're not, what Imran Khan has raised, and these three elements of pushback that I identify, aren't particularly new or unknown. The previous government was frustrated with some of the elements even as they negotiated it. The problem is that it's hard to negotiate with a stronger partner. It's hard to negotiate with a stronger partner when you've already made concessions. And so that competitive balance is difficult to shift, and it's one that illiberal states particularly struggle with, given the weak nature of the institutions. As Pakistan goes to the IMF, the grip of these agreements will be even more of a strain as they become increasingly desperate for foreign exchange, either to hold off the IMF or to reduce the scope of leverage that the IMF enjoys over them by the scope of the program. The second case that I'll talk about is Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka emerged from a protracted insurgency. It's enjoyed a degree of normalcy that was shaken to a severe extent in recent months by the decision of President Trisena to remove the sitting prime minister, install his predecessor as prime minister, and the resulting political crisis, shook the basis of Sri Lanka's democracy. And also, even although it's been resolved in the short term, has, I think, shaken political confidence, both locally and internationally. China's footprint in Sri Lanka predates the Belt and Road and has gotten a tremendous amount of attention, as has China's effort in Pakistan. It centers around the strategic port in Hambantota in southern Sri Lanka. Beijing's relationships in Sri Lanka, like in Pakistan, were built around Beijing's perceived loyalty to local institutions, even during the period of the Civil War. When no one else was willing to provide arms to Sri Lanka's army, Beijing would. And when no one else was able to or willing to cooperate with the government prosecuting that Civil War, Beijing would. And as a result, the loyalty, the political ties are what the strategic positioning of Beijing today in Sri Lanka is based on. The Hambantota port has gotten a lot of attention for its unusually long contract length as a renegotiated agreement. After President Trisena was elected, he sought, as a result of a balance of payments squeeze, to renegotiate the terms of the port with China as a result of the debt problem. In exchange for that renegotiation, he was forced to grant an extra long 99-year lease for operational control of the port. Operational control is not a Hong Kong-like relationship. It's not, ceding Sri Lankan territory. the kind of fear is that it could be made to be that, but that's not what's happened. But it is evidence of the difficulty that a state like Sri Lanka, or a state like, I contend, these illiberal states have for getting from kind of adjusting the terms, shaving off the excesses of agreements once they're reached. There were two other features, two features to Sri Lankan pushback. First, all of the pushback was really checkbook driven. It was really a balance of payments and debt problem, a debt management, public financial management problem. It was not necessarily because of over access, although it's become that a little bit, and it's not. Although it's been fueled by corruption, the concerns about corruption are internally directed. They're not necessarily within the Sri Lankan system. The blame is internally directed politically towards President Rajapaksa and his team that were involved in making the deals. They're not directed mutually at both sides of the agreements. Another feature. It is also important to note that Sri Lanka is in the unique position among these cases of having another power that has serial strategic influence, in this case India. And while India retains a dominant position politically in Sri Lanka, Indian advocacy to either block or frustrate China's outreach has been ineffective. And that's, again, evidence that it's not countries saying no in an absolute sense to China. These are tactical negotiations and should be understood as such. The third case I'll look at is Malaysia, which is distinct both in geographic positioning and also in terms of wealth. It's the most prosperous of these three cases. It's one of the most prosperous states in Southeast Asia. It also, like the other cases, has an illiberal democracy. It's got a history of single-party dominance that was recently broken as a result of an election. That election was built around corruption concerns, or the challenge was built around concerns about corruption of the former prime minister and his team, Najib Razak, including the one MDB scandal. The irony, of course, of that transition, it's important to note, is that the new leader is himself a known engineer who previously served as prime minister for 29 years as Mr. Razak's predecessor. So it can hardly be said that this is a dramatic shift in party. It's more of a reflection of concerns about corruption locally. Prime Minister Mahathir has announced a series of decisions to delay and cancel Chinese plans. He's canceled approximately $23 billion worth of contracts, including high-speed rail links and pipelines that he deemed, to quote him, unnecessary, and that would impose a burden. Standing in the Great Hall of the People next to the Chinese premier, he lambasted what he called a new version of colonialism, which in many ways is the boldest anti-Belt and Road statement that anyone has made among the recipients. And yet the underlying reality is much more sober and much more cautious than that. Just this week, Prime Minister Mahathir announced that China could come back and continue that East Coast rail link that he had canceled previously on different terms at a lower scale, a lower pay at scale, and with more local content, if they wished. He's been very careful to note that his grievances with corruption internally within Sri Lanka, again, not corruption mutually on both sides of the agreements that were made. Even a country in a favorable economic position like Malaysia is not strong enough institutionally to push back in absolute terms on a corrupt market against both sides of those deal sheets equally. So I'll wrap up so I'll make kind of three general conclusions, and I'll talk about some of the policy implications. So first, it's clear the most popular among these cases, and generalizable among the other cases as well, the most popular grievances towards China's investment come down to corruption, graft corruption in a fairly familiar sense. But in each case, the same factors that made these illiberal democracies vulnerable, their institutional weakness and porousness to corruption at scale, also made it difficult for them to push back against that corruption once it was discovered. And notably, the transition points that make illiberal democracies different than strictly authoritarian regimes revealed the seams in the corruption. Those transitions have served to highlight China's behavior and challenge and result in these short-term challenges to China's behavior. Second, the scale of the Belt and Road financial obligations appears to be a recurring problem. China's ambition is, I think, in a lot of ways laudable, and the infrastructure gap across Asia is real, and I actually agree with a lot of what my colleagues said about the importance in terms of the development of meeting those needs. But these states, particularly these states with weak institutions, really struggle under the stress of long-term debt obligations. Financial obligations made for short-term benefit, political benefit, were quickly challenged as a result of political transitions once those expedient benefits were exhausted. They may not have been able to do anything about it, but the transition points raised public awareness and raised challenge, and I expect will continue to. Third, the demand for local participation in each of these endeavors has grown over time, particularly as Chinese state-owned enterprises have manifested themselves. Arif did a great job of talking about this in regards to Pakistan. In each of these cases, local business groups have voiced loud concern throughout political transition campaigns and found traction with governments, with the new governments. This will also grow over time unless China can find meaningful ways to better involve local firms and local entities. I just point out that the World Bank released a couple days ago, at the end of December, a study on how old China's BRI is, looking at trade flows, and it found, that analysis found, looking back to 2001 in terms of trade data, that the reality is that most of China's trade gain in Asia occurred between 2001 and 2013. More than half of China's overall trade gain went from the moment China joined the WTO until before the Belt and Road Initiative was launched across parties. And the rest of that shift that occurred as a result of the Belt and Road was particularly preferenced in construction materials, steel, in cement, in the related items, and particularly targeted at countries like Pakistan, like Sri Lanka, that were recipients of infrastructure loans. By the way, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that Pakistan's own exports to China have actually declined in the last 5 years, even as CPEC launched in this way. That I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but while China's exports to Pakistan have grown dramatically in these construction areas, Pakistan's exports to China have actually decreased. The reciprocity of these relationships is non-existent. Meanwhile, just to highlight the more general case, in BRI countries, generally, dating back to 2001, all of the rest of the Belt and Road countries' exports to China have only grown by 4%, whereas China's exports have grown meteorically to these countries in that time. So again, reciprocity, this is not a reciprocal arrangement. Finally, on terms of the common themes, I just point out that external political factors have had a negligible effect in each of these cases in terms of generating pushback or in terms of having a meaningful impact on the results of these instances of local pushback. No country was able to compile an attractive alternative to Chinese investment. In Malaysia, Mahathir canceled contracts, but even with the unique characteristics of the Malaysian economy, it's a balance of payment, it's a current account surplus energy exporter, and a wayfaring nation. Even with those unique, and that's not particularly debt stressed. Even in that unique circumstance, Malaysia was able to cancel agreements, but it's still largest investment partner is China. Even so, what economists and what we would call gravity models still hold. Proximity still matters. Proximity and size. And then on the policy side, I just want to make two recommendations. First, it is important to look at political transitions through elections. Illiberal states are hard to deal with. From a policy role, I certainly know that. And China's going to find that out. But they're going to pose a continuing challenge to Chinese investments. While these transitions can reveal concerns, they're not going to transform them overnight. It's going to be the steady drip and the steady growing of grievance and concern, unless China can find ways of remediating those concerns. And second, I'll say for my country, for the United States, for the UK, and other like-minded policymakers, particularly those who hope to block states from accepting Chinese investment. To get back to my earlier point, the key is not to block Chinese investments, but to have persistent local advocacy and awareness of the terms. And these instances of transition create openings, create vulnerabilities for expanding to China's investments, for expanding awareness of some of the unequal terms, and for attempting to strengthen them. While external political support has yet to embolden or enable a country to resist a corrupt bargain in these instances, awareness is going to continue growing. And I think it's one of the ways we need to think about this is to provide real alternatives and meet countries where they are, where they, to Mahathir's word, avoid unnecessary projects and focus on projects that are nationally identified in local communities. And secondly, to make sure awareness is wide and public. One of my concerns right now is the erosion in trust of public institutions and the inability of governments to serve as a traffic cop for fair information. And that I think is a strength that we in the West provide and can continue to provide if we choose. And finally, the case of, and this is what I'll conclude with, the case of these illiberal democracies also highlights the degree to which China's dealings are vulnerable long term. The hangover from a bad deal is enduring and are particularly revealed every time accountability is felt in a system. Countries with representational tenets have instances of accountability on a regular basis. The open question is whether the hangover will deepen when the possible adverse effects of infrastructure investment are felt. When coal projects installed in Pakistan produce, serious health and environmental effects, as I think are starting to be felt in Karachi and in Lahore, where some of these initial projects have been commissioned in the past 2 years, where social dislocation as a result of the import of labor, or the result of as Shirley pointed out, labor at 50% cost is felt. The bottom line is that pushback locally to these investments in these kind of terms is only going to grow over time. And these illiberal democracies can serve as the canary in the coal mine for us as we kind of examine China's rise. But thank you very much.
Great. Well, we've got about 40 minutes before lunch to discuss what we've just heard. Yi-Wei, do you want to come up here? Dr. Yu has unfortunately had to leave. The person who gave the first talk. So to kick things off, before I open it up to the audience, I guess one of the questions really about China as it's developed and become more prominent is, what does a world run on Chinese values look like? Professor Wang talked about this kind of complicated historic and cultural, kind of quite exclusive worldview, exclusive about itself. And I guess this is now becoming a sort of issue for the world outside, because as we deal with the different manifestations of China, we are, kind of also dealing with its identity and all of these complex issues of its belief systems and what it believes about us and what we believe about it. And so depending on from where you stand, and we've heard different perspectives today, it all looks kind of very, very different. It's very dynamic and it's very kind of fluid, and it's very hard to sort of just stop at any particular point and say, this is where we are and this is where we're going, despite the questions that we heard earlier on. So I suppose my question really that kind of haunts this is, we've been complaining for many, many years outside of China to have China say what it wants. Now it's kind of said, or it's saying what it wants, and there are a whole bunch of issues from different partners and different perspectives. And so I suppose, is this, are we looking at something that really looks sustainable? So my first question, I guess, to the panel would be, is this really sustainable? I mean, people have touched on this issue, but in 10 years' time, we'll be sitting here still talking about the Belt Road, and it will have been institutionalized, and it will have been validated, and it will have become part of the sort of architecture, the global architecture in the way that the UN is, or other bodies, that there will be this concept of the Belt and Road, despite all its distinctiveness and difference, which has been accepted, and a consent has arisen around it, and it will be part of the global kind of ideological, economic, soft power, hard power infrastructure that we deal with and we feel is real and impacts on our lives and matters. So the first question is it sustainable? Is it really sustainable? And the second is really this issue of these sort of tensions. It is pretty clear that the current administration in the United States is not super keen on this idea. And Steve Bannon has been sort of saying highly critical things about the Belt and Road and about how it is a kind of cloak for Chinese aggressive intent. So is it really sustainable? I suppose the questions are connected, but is it really sustainable to have these very, very different sort of visions of global order? On the one hand, the kind of thing that we've heard about today, which is incredibly amorphous and incredibly I mean, it's not really about institutions, it's about ideas and embracing each other and harmony and all of these kind of fairly abstract kind of things. And yet we also have a sort of vision of the world which is much more pointy and hard, a China which is accused of exercising sharp power and has been very, very effective in translating its economic powers into geopolitical force in all sorts of different areas. Sharp power is now a concept that the world outside knows and understands, just sort of concept, not soft or hard power, but of Chinese sharp power. So it seems that this is going to be an idea full of tensions and problems and conflicts, and is that vision of a sort of harmonious order where there's the Chinese order and then the Western order or Enlightenment order doomed to a kind of clash and a conflict? So on those questions of sustainability and inevitable conflict, maybe I could ask the last speaker to speak first. Maybe, sure. Michael, you might be able to address those. Yeah, thank you.
So I'm going to take the questions in reverse order. I'll speak to the kind of great power competitive framework first. And the first thing I'd say, as a recovering policymaker, that I think democratic systems are idiosyncratic but not individual. One-man rule doesn't govern, and I didn't particularly care when I was in government what Mr. Bannon thought, but I as he's out of government, I don't know his basis of power. So I think the idea of that is the kind of proverbial challenge point is weak. My own country, the United States, is suffering from a crisis of confidence, but the nature of our regime is tends to be resilient. We've had crises of confidence before. I tend to think that we will recover. One of the benefits of democracy is that it's slow and plodding, and one of the frustrations of democracy is that it's slow and prodding. Second is I have a little bit of trouble having a conversation about kind of real world politics and realpolitik on a elemental scale. It kind of recalls to me my political philosophy courses in graduate school less than kind of my policy-making experience. So I have a little bit of trouble with some of the broader contexts that my fellow speakers spoke of. I can only speak in terms of the great power framework and kind of where the iron meets the road. In that instance, I'd say I actually don't think we've seen a lot of evidence yet of sharp power. And the question is not, so China has been able to turn economic power, economic scale, into political coercive, coercive political influence and power. It is now also trying to develop military capabilities to take advantage of that economic and political positioning, to position itself in what this administration refers to as the Indo-Pacific, and the rest of us just refer to as Eurasia. That whether it will be able to do that, is yet to be seen. It has a strategy that seems to me very smart in terms of its ability to leverage low capital cost disruptive military technologies to kind of point at areas of weakness in U.S. in particular military capabilities. That's a smart disruptive strategy. I'm not sure it's a great sharp power projection strategy. Whether that has staying military power is yet to be seen. On the economic side, I think it's more a question of the future of capitalism and how certainly state capitalism is appealing to many. By the way, it's been appealing to many in the United States in our history as well. We had our own moments where we reacted to economic crisis through things that look a lot like state capitalism. The question for international power politics is whether state capitalism is a modern mercantilism or whether it actually represents local opinions and reacts to them. And that's my point, that illiberal regimes are places where you kind of see the flashes of frustration without the efficacy to respond to those frustrations. And if China doesn't respond, China doesn't respond even when regimes are weak locally, then those flashes of frustration are only going to grow, and I can't hazard a guess what happens when they grow too far. But China can respond in any number of ways. It can, it can respond by buying off the population through other means, right? It can respond by changing course and taking more local participation. And by the way, if it does that, that's a positive for the United States and for the existing neoliberal economic framework. Ultimately, the goal here is to bring economic political power closer to the people, not kind of far away. And more broadly, I'd say there's no. I think one of the ironies, and my colleague talked about in the Afghan framework. That's where I used to work. One of the ironies is that there actually is a lot of complementarity between U.S. and Chinese strategic objectives in Eurasia, in that contested space that you identify. If China were to engage in Afghanistan, involve Afghanistan in the Belt and Road, then many of the strategic problems, security problems that lead the U.S. and NATO to be in Afghanistan would go away. Many of the sources of Afghanistan's problems are in its isolation, and if China can help resolve that ultimate strategic problem, with which, by the way, the U.S., NATO, none of us ever tried to address, then the dilemma that led to the problem in the first place will go away, and that would be a positive. It hasn't. I think the point of the UN resolution you referenced was to call for it to be useful, but China hasn't taken that challenge yet.
Great, thank you. Professor Wang, do you think I mean, you presumably think it's sustainable. Are you not worried about some of the potential conflicts that might be coming up and how manageable they'll be?
When I learned English, I learned that Karl Marx said, when he learned English in his 60 years old, he said, to learn a foreign language, you should forget your native language. Okay? Belt and Road Initiative is a new baby, 5 years old. If you everything use your original model to compare, you made a mistake. But because the history cannot repeat itself, either your history or my history. As I say, it's future-oriented. The world has so many problems. The Belt and Road Initiative is a Chinese approach to try to solve this problem. Maybe, of course, it's not perfect. It's many problems because they touch many keys, including in Pakistan, because the different province, different people, and also regional, Indians, they're worried about that because China-Pakistan corridor past the Kashmir. So, and also global governance. So-called the debt crisis is because the IMF or the Paris Club to use this power to solve their debts. But now those countries have the investment from China, not from the IMF again. So, of course, touch the cheese of those countries. Yes, many problems. But I think that the mentality to challenge the Belt and Road Initiative is like that. Everything China do, bash, because you are non-democrats. So the lady I left, she said, okay, the Belt and Road Initiative divided the world, so-called the democratic countries, non-democratic countries. Democratic countries make a zigzag, like a Mahathir, change the plan. Yes. Another case is Sri Lanka. They also suspended the 1.5 years of the port of the Colombo. Later, they still ask China to resume this project because they cannot find another better choice, like work with China, which provide most efficient and low price to finance, build this port. Not just the port, also financial city. Okay? So I think we are not afraid of the suspend or stop some projects. The sooner or later ask China to do that. These are the costs of democracy. Zigzag. Like a UK, you have a referenda, you have the Brexit. We respect. But sooner or later, I think they find the solution for that. But I don't think this so-called China model, the challenge is your universal values. It's like a China open reform. Like me, I dress like you. My name, People's Republic of China, is given by you, the People's Republic, all the European concept, even China. Communist Party, Karl Marxism, learn from you. Karl Marx born here. So we everything learn from you. What day is today? Is Jesus Christ's birthday. It's not Chairman Mao or Buddha or anybody else. So the Belt and Road Initiative is like Chinese open reform. We learn from the market principles, democratic, but we should adapt the reality of so many diverse and different levels of the countries. So I think that is not to sell the China or so-called China model. It's not pure China model. We help those countries achieve democracy on the basis of the lift of poverty, on the basis to create the preconditions, let the market works. It's like the economic zone. It's like build the swimming pool to train the babies how to swim, and then they can swim in the sea. If we put the babies in the sea to swim, they will die. So that reason so many countries, they suffered a lot from the Washington Consensus. And now China helped to bring the preconditions for let the market principles works. So that's
excellent.
The hope.
You obviously like metaphors, Professor Wang. Your swimming pools and a panda blowing up a balloon.
I like E equals MC squared. That was very
good.
good.
I see. EMC squared. Yes, and Einstein.
That
Yes.
that was very smart.
Thank you very much. That's helpful. So, is it sustainable? Arif, is it sustainable?
Well, I think is the Belt and Road sustainable? I think that raises the issue of what is the Belt and Road, because the Belt and Road label has just been applied towards so many things, and it could very much just amount to a short-term stimulus for Chinese state-owned enterprises, materials companies, construction companies, and then maybe it will fizzle out over the next 5 to 15 years. But with that said, I would be mindful that of China's adaptability as a great power. So even in the case of Pakistan, I had mentioned the fact that there were these protests from the smaller provinces over the perceived inequitable distribution of CPEC projects or BRI projects. And China and Pakistan actually initially, from the outset, created a joint coordination committee, a bilateral joint coordination committee, through which they determine which projects are part of the CPEC portfolio. Over time, they included the chief ministers of all the provinces within sort of the top meetings of the JCC. So, I think that reflects, a liberal government's ability to adapt toward a more liberal society's internal cleavages and to learn how to manage a democratic system. So, we see indicators of that in Pakistan, which is a very diverse country, has challenges of federalism, center-provincial relations, and all of that. In China, I think I'm actually surprised in terms of how it's learned over the past few years to engage a broad array of actors inside the country, whether it's Islamists or Marxist ethno-nationalists or just center-right politicians who kind of dominate Pakistan's center these days. And then, China's also been very responsive to the issue of, who gets what, and sort of, the issue of labor. So if we look at a lot of the electric power plants, China's actually sending Pakistanis to China to train them to operate these electric power plants over the course of time. So it's not really interested in having this sort of mercenary overseas expat workforce that will, dominate the electric power sector in Pakistan. And then, when we look at how, if we can compare, for example, U.S. efforts to gain traction with the Pakistani society, there was the Kerry Berman Act, which was a 5-year, $7.5 billion aid program, I think. I don't know how much was actually dispersed. But anyway, that was sort of, the U.S. effort at the height of the Afghan war to curry favor with the Pakistani populace and cultivate the civilian government as well. Well, we've seen China also invest in Pakistan's social sector, and now China is actually the top destination for Pakistani students who seek education abroad. So it's supplanted the United States and the United Kingdom, which have been traditional destinations. So, there are ways in which China is actually investing in the local populace that I think suggests that, despite the type of political system they have and, the lack of alignment in terms of maybe values, religion, and so on and so forth, it is an adaptable power, even in a country as complicated as Pakistan.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So I'd like to open it up to the audience now. We have quite a few recovering policy analysts here, I believe. You kind of talking to the right audience. So what I'd like is to sort of, I think we've got, is anyone able to, sorry? Oh, sorry, yeah, okay, right. So I've got a kind of couple of microphones here. Is someone able to, Michael, is someone able to hand these out? Sorry. So Michael or someone will go around and hand these to people. If you could say who you, is that okay? Thanks. If you could say who you are and then ask or make your point or ask your question. And I guess if we could sort of maybe start with 2 or 3. So yeah, if I can open it up. Thank you. Yeah, the gentleman there.
Hello?
Yeah,
Is this on? Yes, it is. Thank you very much for organising this event, and thanks to the panel. I'm Lee Jones from Queen Mary University of London, and I've been doing a lot of research on the internal drivers and governance of Belt and Road, and also how it's being received and contested in Southeast Asia in particular. So a lot of overlap with my research with the last 2 speakers in particular. And one thing I'd like to push back on based on my own research findings is the idea that the Belt and Road Initiative is some kind of top-down grand strategy that is very much driven strategically by Chinese elites, because I don't see any evidence of this at all. And if we take to sort of grand strategy a vision of this, that's what leads to the vision offered by the first presentation, where it's about dividing blocks and a new Cold War. And I don't think there's any reason to think that would be the case. Even something as simple as how many countries are in the Belt and Road is, I think, a good illustrator. It started off with about 65 countries in 2013-14. During 2014, it was opened up to Eastern Africa and Europe. And in 2015, President Xi announced it was open to the entire world. So we cannot say numerically, these countries are going to be the ones that benefit, these are the ones on the inside, these are the ones on the outside. It's not like that. In 2017, the Chinese government prohibited even the publication of Belt and Road Initiative maps. There are no official maps of the Belt and Road Initiative because there is no clear top-down strategy. There is not one belt, one road, but 3 land routes, 2 maritime routes, and 6 corridors. High-level plans, when you study them, are exceedingly vague. There is very weak top-level coordination. The actors involved are not being clearly managed. And there is very weak oversight of outbound investment and aid in China, extraordinarily shonky. So that kind of shonky governance on the Chinese side interfaces with the shonky governance on the recipient side to produce actual outcomes. And they often aren't what any strategically minded person would have envisaged or desired. Take the point made about leveraging low capital costs. Actually, most of the loans involved are commercial rate, much more expensive than borrowing from, say, Japan or the multilateral development banks, usually about 6%. You could borrow at 0% or 0.5%. There are no military gains to be had either. The Hambantota port, for example, the PLA Navy cannot use that port. So the idea that this was some kind of strategic debt trap, I think there's no evidence for that. In fact, I think the reverse is true, in a sense, that China is also potentially falling into a debt trap. And this relates to the point about chickens and eggs raised by Professor Wang. Okay, you give a chicken to the recipient, and you hope that it lays eggs, so you can get another chicken back later down the line. This is all about exporting the China model of infrastructure-led development, where you put infrastructure down and you hope that industry grows up around that and generates a net return so that the loans can be repaid. That is a model that is demonstrably failing in China now because of the acquisition of massive surplus capacity in the basic industries and the slowdown of the economy, leading to the need for structural adjustment. It's a model that has failed in Southeast Asia through the creation of Chinese industrial parks since 2000, most of which haven't been profitable. And it's failing in Belt and Road Initiative countries as we speak, leading to the kind of crises and pushbacks that we're talking about. So we should be looking below the level of geostrategy and not talking about Mackinder and this kind of nonsense, and thinking about the political economy and governance drivers of actual practices and outcomes. Thank you.
You sound skeptical. The gentleman over there, yeah.
David Kemaspetti. I'm a KCL alumni and ex-army officer. Spent a lot of time in Pakistan, also in the oil industry as well as in uniform. I know we're dealing with a security situation this afternoon, but I'd just like to ask probably Arif and maybe the others a question on CPEC. Obviously, Baluchistan is a contentious issue with the CPEC, and there's still problems there on the security side, which we can cover this afternoon. But I'm sort of a little baffled 4 or 5 years into CPEC as to why what I would see as the sort of real important part of CPEC, which is access to the Arabian Sea through Gwadar, is developing so slowly. There are security concerns, but I would have thought that China would have put in huge investment into Baluchistan, sort out the water shortages in Gwadar, get the roads moving. I know there are new roads going through Baluchistan, but it's single track. There's no investment in hotels or infrastructure. It's very, very slow development through Baluchistan. no industrial zones popping up anywhere and that sort of thing. Why has there been no, real urgency on getting the Baluchis on side and pushing forward with Gwadar Port?
Right. I mean, that's a question I've sought to answer as well, and have yet to. It suggests that there's a lack of coherence in terms of China's own aspirations for the corridor. So we do have China directly funding the realignment of the Karakoram Highway, and then also one segment of the Karachi to Lahore motorway. So that could connect actually China to Karachi itself, which is home to 2 major ports, so not even Gwadar itself. So there's no single corridor or highway that is being built connecting China to Gwadar itself. Effectively, the road network that is being constructed through CPEC is just Pakistan's national highway network. So it could be used by China, it could be used by Afghanistan, it could be used by many of the Central Asian states. It could be used for connectivity between India and Pakistan. Western India, Punjab can access sea, like Amritsar and some of these cities can access sea through using Pakistan's own national highway network, some of which is being rehabilitated or upgraded through CPEC. So in terms of, there isn't, the practice and the expenditures don't necessarily correlate to any coherent plan for economic activity. So we don't see, China investing, along the full breadth of the notional CPEC corridor. There's reluctance to invest in the industrial zones. And then even low-hanging fruits, some of which you had mentioned, such as, social sector projects in Balochistan to, cultivate the local populace and address some of their long-standing grievances. China has, built a hospital, has built a school there, but the most pressing issue is the lack of water. China, if it wanted, it could, there was a plan to build a desalination plant in Gwadar, and that was initially the part of the initial CPEC plan, and for some reason has yet to gain approval in Beijing, and now will be funded, it is being funded by the government of the UAE. So, and that's because of the efforts of the Pakistan Army, which have close ties with the UAE, so it's an Army UAE project. But if they really wanted to suggest that this project would be a game changer for the local population, it could simply invest $20 million in a local desalination plant and provide free water to the population of Gwadar is around 100,000. It's a very small populace in terms of an actual city. And that would take a lot of the air out, much of the air out of some of the criticism of Beijing and the claims that it's a colonial power and all of that. So as for why that is not being done, I'm not sure. It could just be that this is not a priority for them, or that there's some bureaucratic reason. And then it's just a lot of these issues to some extent have to also deal with the inadequacy of the Pakistani state and its own poor prioritization. So and perhaps it's a metaphor for the Belt and Road. As I mentioned in my presentation, I don't know what CPEC is. I've studied it for the past 3 years, but we can say it's a corridor, but I'm not sure what a subway project or a metro rail project in the city of Lahore has to do with facilitating trade between Pakistan and China. So, so I think it's it could just be a vacuous term that has little value in terms of the practical world.
Can I take the first comment and respond to that second comment?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So I agree with much of what Dr. Jones said, and the most important thing you said is that CPEC is a bottom, or the Belt and Road is understood as a bottom-up, not a top-down effort. What China's done in a lot of these places, and in Pakistan in particular, is go to, in many cases, illiberal regimes with a free hand of capital, seemingly, and say, what are your wildest dreams? And these regimes that tend to not have long-term plans themselves, tend to be subject to short-term political whims, and answer in that sense. And one of the things from a U.S. policy perspective, I was part of the planning for the U.S. development assistance in 2009 and 2010, is that when the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor started, the wish list was exactly the same thing they gave to us. We chose not to do those things, not because many of them were bad, but because our tools weren't well matched with large-scale highway building or the installation of coal-fired power generation, for example. That wasn't what development assistance is for. But the wish list wasn't new. This isn't something that was generated by Beijing. On the Gwadar point, it's also, I would make the exact same point, that this is a desire on the part of Pakistan's army in particular, not a desire on the part of China. And it's convenient to talk about Gwadar as a node in some kind of transcontinental network, trade network. But the reality is that there's very little likelihood that there will ever be a meaningful economic relationship over the highest border crossing in the world between China and Pakistan. There's really no provision for a large-scale road. There's no effort right now, although people talk about huge loans to build a railroad along that corridor. There's only one pipeline in the world, oil pipeline or gas pipeline in the world at a higher elevation. It's in Chile. It was built by a U.S. firm, U.S. and British firm. There's really no, with current technology and at any reasonable level of capital expense, feasibility to the idea of this as an international commercial corridor. I look forward to being proven wrong. I look forward to Beijing, because I think Pakistan and that part of Asia would be better off if it were more connected in a web of infrastructure. But the Himalayas are a barrier that are going to be difficult to conquer. And Himalayas to Gwadar are a barrier that is even more difficult to conquer.
Yeah, maybe a couple more then. The lady there, and then the gentleman over there. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Sally MacDonald. I'm from Marlborough Fund Managers. I wonder if you could talk about the coincidence of counter offers for financing in almost every Belt and Road project in the ASEAN area as opposed to Central Asian area that we're seeing from the Japanese at the moment. So typically, as Lee was saying, any given Chinese project is offering finance at fairly commercial terms, 3 to 5% for 10 to 25-year projects at reasonably commercial rates. I fully appreciate that the terms are definitely not commercial when you come down to the nitty-gritty. The Japanese are typically offering 50-year finance with the first 10 years interest-free and the rest at 0.1%, effectively free money. And a lot of countries are looking at choosing between those two financing sources. You haven't really mentioned that at all, and that conflict and how that fits in, and why it should be that Japan, US ally, is looking to stymie so many of those Chinese BRI projects.
Great, and then the gentleman who's just at the end here.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the speakers for some very interesting and illuminating comments. My name is Andy Thomas. I'm actually doing my retirement PhD in another aspect of China. Professor Wang particularly talked about the networks and the interconnectivity of the Belt and Road Initiative. And it seems to me that that is the heart of what we are talking about. It's interconnectivity, however the mode of expression is. And that's the emphasis that I would put forward for it, not so much what happens in that particular country. I mean, I would say as an aside that if I was administering a country, I wouldn't want a foreign power building a military-grade road between the airports and my capital city. However people do in Cambodia and so on, I mean, that is there. But to me, I think the perspective is about network. The mode of expression might be cable, it might be oil and gas, it might be physical infrastructure, the highway, it might be about airports and airline coordination. But what it's about is who controls the network is the most powerful person. I mean, Foucault talked about networks as having embedded power. And I think what we have here is that Foucauldian embedded power. Who controls the BRI network has the power. It's not really about Eurasia, it's about the control of networks.
Great, okay, so to just wrap up, so there's a question about the top-down grand strategy and skepticism about that, the question about counter-offers by competing powers, Japanese and others, and connectivity. So if you wanted to address any of those, maybe start from Professor Wang. We only have a few minutes, so maybe a couple of minutes each. So Professor Wang.
Thank you. Who control? No one can control. It's like the blockchain. This is against any hegemonic power. It's not hierarchy. This is the 21st century. So new technology. We said the mutual connectivity is not one hub. Many people question about the port because the new port usually 10 years, not to make money. Why China interest? So from economic cannot explain, and then military. China want to control this, like Hanman-Todd port. When I visit, I found the logic is like that. If you have a new restaurant, not make money. But if you have the new McDonald's, make money, because it's about the chain. So Hanman-Todd port, financed by the Chinese Commercial Limited, in 10 years, they want to make money. They invested in 24 countries, 75 ports. They built this port, connect each other. For instance, China is a number one trade country in the world. The ships, the time ships, which full of the cargoes, leave Guangzhou with half oil. Why with half oil? Because you need more goods. And then land in Singapore, use up the oil, and then add another half oil, and then change it and half of the goods. And then in Hanman-Todd port in the future, another half from Singapore to Hanman-Todd. And Hanman-Todd maybe to Guadalajara port or Djibouti, and then to Belarus of the Greece. So this is about all the global logistic chain. And then they make money. So 10 years they make money at the new port, but in the long term, they make money. So this is about that. So the Belt Road Initiative for many criticisms because you view with that from the macro laws. You should have the telescope to view the beautiful lady. The beautiful lady with the macro dirty, but the telescope, beautiful. So it's about the centennial projects, okay? So this is about time space. It should go beyond the traditional logic. Another question about the interest rate of the Chinese invest compared to the Japan or other IMF. Yes, the Chinese investment of the interest rate is not so comparative. Some people even complain about that. But it's not just about the money. First, it's no interference in domestic affairs. The other, World Bank or the Asia Development Bank is a very high standard, the political, democracy, good governance, many preconditions for that. Chinese, not that, very flexible. Second, it's not about just investment. It's about, as I said, it's a value chain. It's about the cluster of the industries. So this makes more Chinese investment, other investment, focus on the infrastructure, long-term prosperity of those nations. That's very important. And then lastly, also the gentleman raised about questions about top-down or bottom-up. In China, we say that coordination, not just top-down or bottom-up, either or is coordinate. So easy-going for top-down for some countries. But at the same time, like Pakistan, there is a tribal system. Not that the central government cannot control everything like China. They're very diverse. In Africans, similar. So we should both top-down and bottom-up, so coordinate that. Like in Cambodia, they have 5,000 NGOs. If you just make a deal with the central government, not make sense in the local governments. So we should do both. So that's gradually. At the same time, I think the China-Pakistan economic corridors, many criticisms. But if you focus on the Pakistan itself, many problems, because Pakistan, so difficult. But if you compare with like in Africa, we also built the railway connected Mombasa to Nairobi, Kenya. This is not benefit to Kenya, contributed more than 1.5% of the economic growth, but all the benefit is 6 Eastern African countries, like Rwanda, Uganda, all these can access to the ocean. So all these benefits, the regional integration, is like a Chinese economic delta. I think that go beyond of the China-Pakistan corridor to benefit the Central Asians and Afghanistan, and then makes sense. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. James?
I hope so. That's a very hopeful note, because that would be better for all of us. So let me respond to the question about Japan. Prime Minister Abe and his team have crafted what is to me the most cohesive response and in many ways admirable response to the Belt and Road and to China's economic rise. They don't deny that it's happening, the reality, and they don't seek to block it or to. They actually are participating in some important ways increasingly in some of the recipient countries, but they're also starting to challenge it on financial terms, and I think that's a key, as the questioner pointed out. I think that's a key element going forward to helping particularly the vulnerable and fragile underbelly of Asia's economies from making some very bad choices, and that is to actually challenge competitive terms to try to prevent countries or to offer options from countries who believe they have no other option. In the U.S., at moments, there have been moments in time where the United States made a policy direction to do this. Back when the U.S. Export-Import Bank was operational, there was a policy directive in Pakistan to match China Development Bank and China Exim term sheets in terms of concessionary terms, and we thought in this instance a race to the bottom in terms of commercial terms was actually useful in terms of aiding an illiberal democracy to make better choices and also commercially to promote U.S. Capital goods. I mean, I'm not going to hide the ball on that. This was a competitive choice. The U.S. Export-Import Bank has not been operational for several years as a result of domestic politics, and that is an important mistake. But I think there's a lot to be learned from Japan as a case.
Okay, great, thanks, sir. Finally.
And I'll just quickly sort of respond to the question of who controls these networks that are being built. Just to give you an example of how difficult in the future it may be for one single entity to control things, if we look at the motorway that is being built between Pakistan's two largest cities, Karachi and Lahore, only two out of the four segments are being built and financed by China. So the other two segments are being built and financed by private sector investments, bankers in Pakistan, and the other segment is being funded by Saudi Arabia's development arm, or a Saudi-linked development arm. And then, when we look at the Karakoram Highway or the Karakoram Highway, which connects China and Pakistan, that is connected to Pakistan's high-speed motorway network through a new road that is partially being funded by DFID. So we're really talking about our segments along a network, a national highway network, a revamped highway network that is being built for a country of 208 million people, that is at the cross-section of connecting Central Asia to South Asia and the Indian Ocean region. So who controls it? Ultimately, I would say it's the government of Pakistan, but even for the government of Pakistan to control a lot of its own territory or institutions is quite difficult. But I just wanted to give you those examples just to problematize this issue of control. And I think I'm very skeptical, as the fellow here was as well, in respect to there being a grand strategy and sort of grand results as a result of a supposed grand plan.
Great, well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank our speakers for their presentations this morning, for all of their work and effort. It's been really helpful. And then I'll hand over to Michael to make a couple of comments. But thank you very much for all that you've done. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to you, Kerry, for chairing the session. A couple of brief announcements, if I may, before we break for lunch. First of all, we will resume this afternoon at 2 o'clock. And our first speaker of the afternoon will actually be online from the United States. So for technological reasons, we will start promptly, just to warn you of that. Secondly, I know that as a result of quirks in the way in which the Eventbrite booking site works, one or two people were only able to book for the morning. This is mostly people who were on the wait list. But it's quite clear that there will be space for you in the afternoon as well. If there are any of you here who are in that position and would like to be here this afternoon, please